Welcome to Live with the Author. Today, we have a really exciting episode where we're going to be talking to one of our wonderful special issue authors. I'm Amanda Goodwin, and I'm one of the editors at Reading Research Quarterly. I'm also an associate professor at Vanderbilt University. And today we have with us Claude Goldenberg. Claude, welcome.
Thanks, Amanda. Delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. So Claude, I always like to ask as we're kind of getting into this, how did you get interested in this topic?
Well, I came to graduate school having taught junior high in San Antonio for a couple of years after college in a largely Latino, poor immigrant Latino neighborhood district. And I came to graduate school really interested in the challenges that kids face who come to school with limited English proficiency and other challenges as well. I mean, low income, immigrant status, I mean, these are all serious challenges that kids face. We now call these ELs. Back in the day, they were limited English proficient or non-English proficient. Now we call them ELs or emergent bilinguals. And my dissertation was a study of 9 ELs in kindergarten who were at risk for poor reading outcomes based on some indicators I collected. So I followed them over a year till the end of first grade in order to find out why some did okay in learning to read. These indicators are not perfect by any means, and there are a lot of false negatives and false positives, but I wanted to find, which kids actually did better than expected, and which ones, as predicted, did poorly, and see if I could figure out why some ended up doing poorly and while some ended up doing pretty well. So then after finishing, it was a qualitative study. I mean, it was a series of case studies over about 15 months. So then after finishing my PhD, I was not interested in being a professor. I wanted to teach first grade and because I thought I had it all figured out, right? So what better thing to do than to go to first grade classroom and, fix at least, if not the world, at least my first grade classroom. Well, I came to understand that, shall we say, my understanding was somewhat limited of specifically the teaching reading. I mean, I knew a lot of things were involved. I mean, you don't need my dissertation to tell you that, but I found a lot of home factors and school factors, and you need a good curriculum, well implemented. But my understanding of the instructional parts were, let's just say, very incomplete. So, reading in English learners, I learned a tremendous amount my first couple of years. One of the reasons was I teamed with someone who had a very different perspective. I came with a very meaning-focused, comprehension-oriented focus to beginning literacy instruction. She had a very traditional code focus. The first 6 weeks of our partnership were, shall we say, not exactly a honeymoon. But
kind of reminds me of the science of reading itself.
There you go. I was living the science of reading. But we came to sort of appreciate how our perspectives kind of complemented each other. And I realized that I was taking for granted a lot of what we now call bottom-up, alphabetic skills and so forth, that I was just sort of taking for granted. And you can't take them for granted. That's one of the things that I learned. So reading in ELs has been sort of the core of my work for, well, actually longer than I care to acknowledge.
Well, that is so interesting. And I think it's the perfect sort of segue into the science of reading. And so, Claude, I also always ask people, the science of reading can be interpreted in so many different ways. What is the science of reading to you? Right.
Well, first of all, let me just tell you, I'm not capable of saying anything in a few seconds or maybe in a few hours that's meaningful about what is science, what is scientific research. I just refer you to, you're probably familiar with the NRC, National Research Council report from almost 20 years ago, 2002, on scientific research and education. And, it lays out a reasonable definition. It includes elements that shouldn't really surprise anyone, posing questions that could be answered empirically, investigating those questions directly and transparently, looking for replication and generalization and so forth. Now, I also want to point out that the definitions don't presuppose, and I'm going to read the direct quote so I don't get it wrong. The definitions say, very different methodological approaches must often be used in various parts of a series of related studies, right? So this methodological can you call it ecumenicalism, is very often missing from the discussion because people equate science and science of reading with randomized control trials,
Right.
or at least stuff with lots of numbers. Now, that stuff is important, right? Don't leave home without it. But to limit the science to things that are only quantitative and only experimentally designed is, I think, to be missing an important point. And this scientific research in education points that out. Now, it's not a top level point, right? Their top level points are pretty traditional scientific, but buried in there is the important caveat that no particular methodological approach is presupposed. So let's not lose sight of that. The other thing I want to point out in this context, Amanda, is, Mark Seidenberg has pointed out, and I try to point out in my article, I wanted to make it a bigger deal than it was, but, I had too many words already.
Editors.
Yeah, I mean, just too many words. So you got to be judicious, parsimonious. And that is that the science of reading that refers to what we know, that kids need to know and be able to do in order to be successful readers, sorry. That science is pretty good, maybe even very good. But the science of reading instruction, right? What you have to do as a teacher or as a parent or anyone in the business of helping kids learn to read, what you have to do to help readers be successful, that's not so good.
And also in different contexts.
Well, that's part of it. That's part of it. The context matters. But the point I really want to make is in research, in nerdy research speak, there's a lot of unexplained variance. So even though, the 5 pillars of reading instruction, those are good and solid, but even if you do all those things as prescribed by the National Reading Panel or anyone else, there's still a lot of unexplained variance that we're still trying to figure out. And while the science of reading, what you need to know to be able to read successfully is, like Seidenberg says, pretty darn good, the science of teaching reading, right? So call it SOTR, science of teaching reading, in contrast to SOR, science of reading. The science of teaching reading, I mean, we got some foundational knowledge for darn sure, right? And don't leave home without that either. But there's a lot more that we really need to understand and push ahead on.
I love that. And we have a few pieces in this special issue that really focus on that point. Tim Shanahan literally calls for a science of reading instruction. And then there's a few pieces that also talk about sort of translation, which I think are all big, important points that you're making.
You mean translational research? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, translational research. So what does it mean to take these findings from basic research, from basic science, or even from the science of reading, but also to get them out into the classroom?
Yeah.
So super interesting things. And I think the point of that this is a method and that there's no single methodological stance that is part of the science of reading are both really important take-home messages.
But I would emphasize, Amanda, that there are some things we know with pretty good certainty. And even though the effect sizes are modest, right? 0.3, 0.5, whatever you consider modest, there are all sorts of different criteria for that. Those are important. And just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we don't know nothing, right? We have to use the basic foundational understandings that we do have and then build on those. We need to get away from this either or dichotomy thing, which I think is the whole point of your science of reading, issue or issues, because you've got another one coming up.
Totally. And Claude, it makes me think, I was working with our local school district on a literacy plan. And it was so exciting. Day one, we all went in and we mapped out what we thought wonderful literacy instruction was. And there was so much agreement because, like you said, there's things that we know that works. But then when we tried to operationalize it,
yes,
it became much more difficult,
yes.
Which is the point you're making, that we still have a lot of work in that area. And I think this kind of links to my next question because it links to your study. So how does your study contribute to our understanding of the science of reading?
Well, I can only hope it will. But first of all, let me distribute. It was not a study. I mean, I didn't do a study to do that. I actually relied.
How does your synthesis?
My synthesis, right. But I do want to point out I relied on a lot of really good studies. I mean, this is part of the science of reading. You have to build on what other people have done. And you may agree, you may disagree, but you can't just ignore it because it doesn't fit your theoretical predilection, shall we say. And I find a tremendous amount of that kind of thing goes on. Things get ignored that are just inconvenient from your theoretical stance, to which I say there's a lot of unexplained variance. Some of that might be helped by might be lurking there in areas that you just dismiss because it doesn't fit your predilections. So yeah, so that's really important. It's part of the definition that I mentioned before, building on what's gone on before, which doesn't mean you have to slavishly adhere to it, but you can't just ignore it because it's, inconvenient. So back to my synthesis. So how can I encapsulate this? So my focus was on what the science of reading, whether SOR or SOTR. I'm going to use those loosely and interchangeably, which is so imprecise. I apologize in advance. But however you conceive of the science, teaching or the science of reading, my focus is what the science of teaching adds to our ability to help English learners become successful readers. I mean, that's the bottom line. That was the whole driving purpose. And my answer is that the science of reading, whether there's a T in it or not, adds a lot. It's very important. I mean, ELs need to learn and be able to do exactly the same things that non-ELs need to do if they're to become successful readers. The issue for English learners is they're English learners. They're learning the language. They're learning to understand and be able to speak a language. They are simultaneously learning to read and write. And that's a big challenge. It's a big challenge for the learners, and it's a big challenge for the teachers, right? On both sides of the desk. It's a huge challenge. So think of it this way. What we know from SOR or SOTR is the foundation for effective literacy instruction for English learners. It's the foundation. But as I say in the article, I mean, if you only got it as a foundation, that's important, but
you're missing the building.
You're missing a lot, right?
Whatever you're constructing.
That's right. So it's important, but other things have to come into play. For English learners, primarily what needs to come into play is because they're limited English proficiency, they need additional support so they can actually get some of that foundation. One of the issues here is how much additional support is needed as a function of their being limited English proficiency. And there's one school of thought, that I talk about in the article that says, well, they don't really need a lot more support. They just need more instruction or maybe clarify a few words. But it turns out if you look at the studies that actually show some effects in beginning reading, there's more than just a few words and additional instruction. Keep doing more of what you're already doing. They really need a better toehold in the meaning of the words themselves. I mean, we know that understanding what you're reading aids in kind of cementing that sound symbol association, the alphabetic principle, that's so fundamental. If you don't understand it, it's much more difficult. It's just simply more difficult.
Like reading non-words.
Well, that's exactly right. Now, reading non-words is a great way to test for your decoding skills. But reading non-words is not a great way to learn to read.
Right.
So you have to provide the support that's needed. Now, at the very beginning stages, when the reading, the meaning loading, shall we say, of what kids are reading is pretty minimal. Vocabulary, cat, dog, whatever you're using, the load is minimum, even when they start reading connected text. So the amount of additional English language support is relatively modest, but it's not unimportant because they don't really, as we know, or we think we know, using the sound symbol system and decoding is the most important gateway to word recognition. But then confirmation, once you've done that, is a very important part of the process. Well, guess what? You can't confirm it if you have no idea what you're reading. Right? So at any level, understanding the words and of course the instructions of what you're expected to do is very, very important. Now that changes over time as the demands of reading and reading text become more complex, right? Once you hit third, fourth grade, whatever that magical transitional period is that we talk about, then the comprehension demands, the vocabulary demands, the syntax demands, the discourse demands get way bigger. And that's where you really start seeing the gap between ELs and non-ELs. So the language demands of being a literate person, whether reading or writing, just increase exponentially. But at all times, teachers need to be mindful of what are those language demands and how to provide the support that the kids need in order to be reading meaningfully, coherently, fluently, and all those other things. So it's that language support that's extremely important, but they need to learn the same things.
Very cool. Very cool. So what does your study mean for teachers? What should teachers do differently tomorrow after hearing about your study?
Yeah, well, first of all, a couple of things. First of all, recognize that what ELs need to learn to become readers, develop as readers, become proficient and successful and joyful readers. I mean, that's what we're after, right? I mean, I don't think there's any disagreement on that. In order for that to happen, they need to learn the same things that non-ELs do. Right? They need to learn the same things. The foundation. Whether you talk about foundation as foundational skills, you know, the alphabetic principle, phonological awareness, sound symbol mapping, decoding, those are kind of the foundational skills. Or you talk about the foundational skills in 3rd, 4th, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, which is robust vocabulary, knowledge of the world, understanding, you know, syntax and discourse. Those things are important for ELs no less than for non-ELs, okay? That's the first thing. But there's a huge BUT but here. Because they lack the grade level, age level, however you define those things, English proficiency skills, teachers need to figure out a way to help provide it to them. Now, there are lots of ways of doing it. This is one area where I think there's a need for a tremendous amount of research. You know, our research on English language development, ELD, is shockingly sparse at all levels. I mean, I can count on half a hand the number of studies that really have demonstrated some successful acceleration of ELD. And then once you get to high school, there's like nothing. You know, there are a few kind of strategic studies that, you know, are useful and we need to build on that most people don't even know about. So if there's an area of research, I'm sorry, you asked about teachers and here I'm talking about area of research. So let me go back to teachers. Sorry, I'm glad I caught myself. So teachers need to know that they need the same skills, but they need to be mindful of the language demands that learning those skills for the kids, the language demands required of kids in learning those skills and be able to provide them.
And there I mean, I think we all want to provide those language skills. What are a few ideas for teachers to be able to provide those language skills? Or what are some of the things if somebody comes up to you and says, how do I scaffold language? I know my kids need that language. How do I scaffold it? What are the first 3 things that come to mind for you?
Well, I'm sorry to answer. It sort of depends on at what level you're talking about. So if we talk about beginning literacy, and I would just not to put in a plug for the article, but there are a couple of really wonderful studies that I rely on a lot. One by Sharon Vaughn and her colleague, another one by Linnea Airy and her colleagues. And I quote sort of at length their description of the language supports they were providing. Now these are all these were at-risk kids, you know, around 1st grade, K1, 2, in that neighborhood, and they were having difficulty learning to read. In Sharon Vaughn's case, they were bona fide ELs. In Airy's study, they were not ELs. This is one of the things we might want to talk about, the difference between instruction for ELs and non-ELs. But in both cases, those kids got robust literacy instruction, right, that we provided to any group of kids. But in addition to that, they made sure that the words and the text they were reading, they understood them. The instructions that kids were expected to follow either orally or in writing, draw, write, circle, that they understood those words. I mean, when I taught 1st grade, I would teach those as sight words. I'd call them function words. Whether I was teaching in Spanish or in English, I would teach as sight words certain words that would help make them more independent. Because I'd give them like seat work assignment or homework, whatever. They would say, draw something or dibuja. And I wanted to make sure they could read that, not necessarily decode it as a sight word so they could become more independent. So the stuff, the words and text they're reading, the instructions are expected to read. You need to teach that language and you need to have at least some conversations with the kids orally about what it is they're reading. Even simple texts contain messages that are, you know, discussable. You know, you can say things about them. So the text that they were coming into contact with became part of their oral functioning, their oral vocabulary, their oral environment. They just not come across these things just in writing, because, you know, in writing, it's not very meaningful, you know, either because you can't decode it or because you don't understand it. Had to become part of their functioning vocabulary and, shall we say, conceptual space. And it's relatively simple early on because the texts are relatively simple. The challenge becomes much more serious, you know, later on. And then you have to do things like make sure the background knowledge is in place to read and understand certain things. You know, I spent some time years ago working on something called instructional conversations, which is a way of structuring discourse between teachers and students. And we did this with ELs. And one of the things that we found was that with kids with really limited English proficiency, the instructional conversations didn't really do such a great job. You had to reach some level of English proficiency to be able to benefit from these relatively high level oral discussions. So that was something that we discovered that I think is really important. You know, you have to be mindful of the level of English proficiency of the kids in relationship to the concepts and texts that you're expecting them to, you know, read, comprehend, certainly learn from. So that's the general principle.
And those seem super important. In those cases where your proficiency is below the level of the conversation, are visuals critical at that place?
You know, I would say yes, but not from any study that I've done. Just from the standpoint of, well, first of all, as I'm sure you know, visuals are sort of a standard part of your toolkit if you're doing sheltered instruction or, you know, however you define assisted or scaffolded instruction for ELs. So yeah, visuals are very important. There's a huge literature base, you know, on learning from visuals. But here's the thing that I discovered in doing the article, that even when you provide those scaffolds, studies that have been done, ELs, non-ELs benefit identically.
That was a big takeaway for me. There was two takeaways for me. It was that ELs and non-ELs were benefiting identically, but also you reviewed the literature and you found that when teachers were given professional development on, you know, different languages.
Science. It was science instruction.
Yeah, they benefited, the ELs and the non-ELs benefited additionally. And so there's something, like you said, there's something about the additional scaffolding, but it also seems like we need to support teachers to develop these skills. And when we do, it benefits all.
It benefits all. Now, I mean, the reason that finding and talking about it makes me a little nervous is I want to make sure people don't walk away with saying, well, it's just good instruction, right? Good instruction for EL is just good instruction. Well, you know, I'm not ready to throw in the towel on that. And here's why. The gap between the ELs and the non-ELs stayed the same. Now, if we're happy with that, okay, then it's just good instruction. I don't know anyone who's happy with that. I mean, the whole EL project is about closing the gap. So if we're doing good instruction that is benefiting both equally, good, but that gap is still there. That's one of the many, you know, variants that we need to figure out, explain, understand, because we want to close the gap.
Absolutely.
So it's not just good instruction. Clearly something else is needed that we're not quite getting a handle on. And the conclusion I come to is my hypothesis, you know, my candidate for what's needed is super accelerated English language development.
Fascinating. So what does this mean for principals and policymakers?
Look for ways to super accelerate English language development. I mean, well, two things. First of all, you got to make sure that the foundations of effective instruction for everyone are in place. I mean, I go to a lot of classrooms, see a lot of stuff, and people are focusing on English learner instruction, but there's not always, how should I say, a very creaky base that they're putting the EL instruction on. You know, things that people take for granted because they think everybody knows, but there are tenets of effective instruction that are hardly at this point, pardon the expression, brain science. Things like clear instructions, you know, and modeling and being clear on what you're trying to help kids accomplish and communicating that to them and checking for understanding. I mean, you know, you go down the list. Most of those things are just missing in any adequate way from classrooms. So that's got to be in place, because otherwise it's just a lot of baubles and window dressing. So those foundations of effective instruction absolutely need to be in place. But then we need to think about, okay, are we providing the kids not just the language, see, here's the important thing, not just language support, but language development. Language support is one thing, and that was popularized with, sheltered instruction and so on and so forth. And I'm not opposed to language support, but it's not the same as language development. And the argument that I make in the paper is that one of the reasons this gap isn't closing is because we're not closing the language proficiency gap. I mean, in a sense,
so tell us a little bit about language development. What's the distinction between language development and language support?
Right. Well, language support is in the service of helping kids learn the academic content, right? So if I'm a limited English proficient student and I'm expected to read something or learn something from a classroom discussion, a lesson, a lecture, whatever, then, for example, you suggested visuals, right? Visuals. There's also something called realia, right? Real objects. If you can do a lesson on chemicals, you bring to the classroom some Lysol, if you can find it, of course, Clorox, different chemicals in our everyday. There are graphic organizers, things that sort of kind of make up, or, shelter, right? They make up for the lack of English proficiency. Now, in theory, they're supposed to also promote English language development. Whether they do or they don't is up for grabs. I've not seen any really convincing evidence that they have, but okay, I don't know everything. But the purpose is to help kids access the content due to their limited English proficiency. It's content instruction primarily. English language development, the target of instruction is the language itself. You want to promote English proficiency, speaking, listening, understanding. Reading and writing are actually a part of it, but I'm really focusing on listening and speaking. We've done a not very good job promoting English language development. When some colleagues from one of the centers a few years ago did a review of this research, Fred Genesee, you probably know the report, it's like, 20 years ago, and my colleague Bill Saunders did a review of the ELD literature. He found shockingly few, I mean, you can count on 2 fingers, the number of studies that actually studied and evaluated English language development programs as to the extent to which they actually promoted English language development. Now, since then, there have been a couple of others, but we really know shockingly little from any research perspective on how to promote English language development. Not just support in the face of limited English proficiency, but English language development that actually promotes your English proficiency.
Yeah, it makes me think, yesterday I was talking with Emily Phillips Galloway, who has a wonderful manuscript in this special issue that talks about academic language development. And she sort of emphasizes that it's not just skills in academic language that we're teaching, but also the practice and the use of the language.
Yes.
As a way of advocating, as a way of communicating, as a way of sharing thinking. And the example she gave was a bunch of kids who were learning about certain language and learning how to use that language and analyze that language. And one of the kids' conclusion was, I don't really know if this person's an expert, but I know that if I want to be an expert, I can use these words to sound like one. Yeah. And so it's that idea of learning how language can be used to show your.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond the words. That's another point that I would make. I mean, typically, vocabulary is front and center on ELD or language supports or whatever. Now, vocabulary is super important, right? I don't mean to minimize its importance, but it's only one facet of language. Right. There are all sorts of discourse skills, and I think this is what, Amanda, you were referring to, all sorts of discourse skills that are necessary if you're going to participate in a conversation, and I see very limited, if any, attempts to really push that aspect of English language development. I mean, it's relatively
I think people are starting to tackle that, yeah. But I think we're, just like you're saying, we need to be farther and we need to move faster.
Yes.
If we want to close that gap. And so part of me reading your article and reading all these other ones where they're starting to try that is that understanding that what these teachers were doing for English language learners, this explicit language
Yes.
instruction,
Yes.
supported ELLs, which is our goal, but also non-ELLs. And so there's a power, it seems like, in teaching about language, period, and teaching about language as this practice, as this thing that we do. You know, and especially in the time of COVID and this time with, as we're addressing racial inequities, we've got an opportunity to use language and to teach language in a way that shows its power, hopefully.
Absolutely. One of the sort of ideological issues that we run into is if you go too far out on that path, and I'm completely with you, people say, yeah, but what about honoring the language the kids bring with them, right? What about the language of the home and the community? And it gets complicated. You know, it gets gnarly. There are ideological, there are political, there are theoretical questions to sort through. So we've always been sort of in a fraught space. And
Totally.
language can be the fraudest of all.
Well, I think education's fraught, right? I mean, it's all about us as teachers, as researchers, as educators, figuring it out how to address the inequities that are clearly present, and and as part of that, honor what our students are bringing to the classroom. And I think part of that language instruction that can be critical is looking at this language that we're using and how it does represent hegemonic perspectives.
Yeah.
And you know what that really means. So super exciting stuff. And so Claude, as we're kind of thinking about the messages of your manuscript, what are some takeaways that you think we should take away from this study? Not study, this synthesis.
Thank you. I don't want to misrepresent it. Well, yeah, I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, I think there are at least two really important ones. First of all, learning to read as an EL is in many ways very, very similar to learn to read as a non-EL. You have to learn the same sorts of things, skills, knowledge, understandings, phonological awareness, the alphabetic principle, decoding, you know, going from speech to print and back again. Those are foundational. You know, you need to learn that and teachers need to teach it. But at the same time, ELs need not only additional support, but additional English language development instruction in order to be able to access what they're reading. So I'm glad you pointed out, Amanda, the distinction between support and teaching English language development. I think both are needed. You know, in the early stages, there's very little distinction because by teaching kids the words they need in order to understand what they're reading, you're promoting English language development, right? So there really is no distinction there. The challenge comes, you know, later on when the reading literacy agenda becomes so much more complex, so much broader, and the amount that needs to be taught, both in terms of literacy skills and in terms of English language development skills and knowledge and understanding are so great. So we need support, but we also need not just support, but enhancing, promoting, accelerating English language development. I mean, it's absolutely essential. And I think, you know, that should be something at the forefront, in addition to maintaining those, don't let go of those basic things. I mean, it's hard because you got to think of a couple of seemingly contradictory things, but I don't think they're contradictory. They work together. Keep the base, keep that basic understanding that all kids need to learn, but then for ELs, be extremely mindful of the language development needs in order to support, but also to propel English language development. I think that's our best course forward.
Well, I think it's exciting. You know, I mean, the one thing I also love that you said is knowledge. I feel like a lot of times when we're working with ELLs, you know, we take the content out because we assume that the language is too complex or too difficult for our English language learners or our emergent bilinguals. And so I love that you put knowledge center for that. You know, to develop language, to develop literacy, to develop this foundation involves also developing knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's
Well, you
another
did.
takeaway.
I'm just listening and learning. So thank you so much for sharing, Claude.
Oh,
It is
thanks, Amanda.
wonderful to have you here. And if you're interested in learning more about Claude's piece, you can find it in our first special issue on the science of reading. And it's entitled Reading Wars, Reading Science and English Learners by Claude Goldenberg. Thanks so much for joining us, Claude. And honestly, I love listening and love learning.
Thanks, Amanda. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take care.